They said Odessa Vane had bought a truckload of glue. 14 horses, auctioned off in a single lot because no one wanted them separately. A bay with a ewe-neck and a habit of rearing at gates. A gray mare who'd gone half-blind in her left eye and flinched at shadows. A gelding so herd-bound he'd thrown 3 riders trying to keep him from his pasture mates. Broken wind, broken knees, broken trust. The auctioneer had sold them fast, almost embarrassed, and Odessa had raised her paddle without blinking. $3,000. 14 horses. $214 a head for animals worth less than the trailer hauling them. You bought the cull pen, said Denny Waite, who ran cattle 2 sections over and had a mouth for arithmetic. Every one of those horses has a reason nobody wanted it. I know, Odessa said. That's why I wrote the reasons down. She kept a ledger. Her grandfather Silas had kept one before her, 40 years of it, water-stained and packed into a cedar box she hadn't opened since his funeral. That night she opened it. On the inside cover, in his blunt hand, a horse that won't line up with the herd is telling you something about the ground, not about itself. 12 miles west, across a dry wash and a stand of dead cottonwoods, Thomas Reyes was being told the same kind of thing about Stone. He'd spent $11,000, most of what remained after his father's estate cleared probate, on a contour survey and 2 tons of fieldstone, to build what his Aunt Corazon had called swales. Not ditches. Swales, dry stacked and staggered, cut sideways across the slope instead of down it, meant to catch runoff before it could run at all. You're burying money in a hillside, said the same Denny Waite, standing at the fence line with his hat pushed back. Water finds its own way down. Always has. That's the problem, Thomas said. It finds the fastest way down. I wanted to find the slowest. Corazon's notebook was thinner than Silas Vane's, but denser. She'd built swales through the drought of '78, back when the county wells had failed one by one and hers hadn't. Her handwriting slanted hard right, angry almost, as if the words themselves were in a hurry. Every inch of fall you fight is an inch of water you keep. Fight for the inches. Thomas didn't know Odessa Vane except by reputation, the woman who'd bought the cull pen. She didn't know him except as the fool burying stone on a hillside that had never held water in living memory. Neither one thought much of the other's plan. Both were, in their own estimation, doing the only sane thing left to do. Odessa's first attempt at working the 14 went wrong on a Tuesday. She'd read Silas's notes 3 times over. His method wasn't training in the ordinary sense. It was what he called mosaic grazing, moving horses in tight rotational blocks so their grazing pattern chewed the grass down in a patchwork instead of a sheet, breaking up the fuel load section by section. Cattle wouldn't do it. Cattle grazed even and flat. Horses, worked right, grazed selective, restless, uneven. If you moved them on a schedule tight enough, they'd leave a landscape striped instead of solid. A fire crossing striped ground had to keep finding new fuel. A fire crossing a solid field just ran. The math in the ledger was exact. 45 minutes per paddock block, no more, no less. Long enough for real grazing, short enough that no horse settled into a lawnmower pattern. 6 blocks a day, 9 days to complete a full rotation across the west pasture. She ran the 14 through their first rotation, and it fell apart in under 3 hours. The herd-bound gelding screamed and paced the fence instead of grazing. The one-eyed mare wouldn't cross from block 2 into block 3, refused flat, feet planted, sweat breaking on a cool morning. By the time Odessa gave up and turned them all back into open pasture, she'd lost 4 hours and gained nothing but a torn line of fence wire and a herd that trusted her less than it had that morning. She sat on the tailgate that night with the ledger open on her knee and made herself write down the failure in numbers instead of feelings. Rotation attempt 1, 45-minute blocks, 6 horses refused transition, 1 fence casualty. Mare left, I would not cross shadow line between blocks 2 to 3. Shadow line. She read the words back to herself twice before it landed. The mare wasn't refusing the pasture. She was refusing the transition, the exact place where the shade of the old fence row cut a hard black stripe across pale ground. A horse blind in one eye, seeing that stripe as something solid. Silas had written about it, 3 pages later than she'd first looked. Never rotate through a shadow line at midday. Move the fence or move the hour. She moved the hour. 6:15 the next morning, low sun, no shadow crossing the gap at all. The mare walked through without breaking stride. Thomas's failure came with water instead of light. His first swale held for 11 days and then blew out in a single afternoon storm. 1.8 inches in 90 minutes, more rain than the whole month usually carried. He stood in the mud afterward looking at a 40-foot gash where dry-stacked stone had simply washed downhill, taking 6 months of labor with it. Corazone's notebook, reread by lantern that night, gave him the number he'd missed. She'd built her swales with a maximum spacing of 60 feet between check structures on any slope over 8%. He'd spaced his at 90, trusting the survey more than the old woman's handwriting, because 90 feet meant fewer stones and less labor, and he was already down to counting both. Water doesn't care what the survey says, she'd written. It cares how far it has to run before something stops it. 60 feet. Not 70. 60. He rebuilt at 60. This time with a spillway notch in every third structure, so the overflow had somewhere sanctioned to go instead of somewhere accidental. It cost him 4 more days and the last of his cash reserve. Denny Waite watched him haul stone with a look that wasn't quite pity and wasn't quite respect, and said nothing at all, which from Denny was its own kind of verdict. By the second month, the doubt in the valley had a shape and a name, and the name was Cole Bannister. Bannister ran the largest spread in the county and sat on the water board, and he had opinions about both of his neighbors delivered with the flat certainty of a man who had never once been wrong in a way that cost him anything. 14 broken horses is 14 broken horses, he told Odessa at the feed store, no matter how you rotate them. Stone doesn't hold water, he told Thomas at the same counter 2 days later. Never has, not out here. You're playing at farming a country that was never built for it. He said it to both of them separately, with the same flat certainty, and neither Odessa nor Thomas paid him much mind. They had their own doubts to manage, and their doubts were pointed at each other. She's grazing horses in a checkerboard, Thomas said to his ally, old Mrs. Aldana, who'd known his aunt and now brought him coffee some mornings out of loyalty to Corazone's memory more than confidence in him. It's a parlor trick. It won't stop a real fire. She thinks the same of you, Mrs. Aldana said, not unkindly. Says you're building a wall to hold back weather. Weather doesn't respect walls. Odessa's ally was younger, Jonah Pratt, 17, hired on for feed money, who mucked stalls and kept his mouth shut and watched the 14 horses with more patience than anyone twice his age. Reyes thinks you're Ledger's superstition, he told her once, grinning. Says a man could grit a pasture with a protractor and get the same result. Let him try, Odessa said. See how fast his protractor bolts when a shadow moves. Neither of them knew, yet, how close together their two properties actually stood along the ridge that separated them. A half-mile of dry wash and stunted juniper, tinder since June, that either could have told you was a fire waiting on a match, if either had thought to look at the other's land at all. By August the rotation was working. 14 horses moved through the west pasture in tight, restless blocks, and the grazing behind them left the ground striped like a plowed field, pale-eaten strips beside strips of standing gold grass, breaking the fuel into pieces too small to carry a running fire far. Odessa's ledger filled with numbers that finally agreed with each other. 41 grazing rotations completed, 206 acres striped, average fuel load reduction, measured crudely, with a scale and a square-foot frame, but measured, 38% inside the gray strips. The one-eyed mare had become, without anyone deciding it, the horse who led every rotation. She crossed shadow lines first now, at any hour, and the other 13 followed her the way cattle follow a bell mare, though she was no such thing by breeding. Just the one among them who'd stopped being afraid of the wrong thing once someone bothered to ask her what the wrong thing was. Jonah had taken to calling her Ruin, half as a joke about her price tag, half because there was nothing else about her left to name. Thomas's swales held through 3 more storms, the water slowing at each staggered wall long enough to sink instead of run, filling the old dry cistern below the 3rd terrace for the first time in Mrs. Aldana's memory. He kept his own rough tally on a barn beam in chalk, cistern depth, inches gained per storm, evaporation loss per week. Not a ledger so much as a countdown toward a number he didn't yet know he was counting toward. The warning signs arrived in the last week of August, and neither of them read them as connected until it was too late to matter which came first. The wind changed. It had blown steady from the west all summer and now it backed around to the north, dry and hot, and smelling faintly of resin, carrying ash from a fire burning 40 miles off that the news called contained and the old-timers called a matter of days. Odessa's horses grew unsettled 2 full days before anyone smelled smoke close. Ruin paced the fence line at dusk, ears hard forward, refusing feed. Odessa wrote it down without understanding it. Herd agitation, no visible cause. Mare Ruin will not settle. The way Silas had taught her to write down everything she couldn't yet explain, because the explaining sometimes came later, and it was easier to trust a number than a memory. Thomas watched his cistern level and felt something worse than doubt. 2 swales upslope, near the property line, had begun to show hairline cracks in the mortar joints. Not failure yet, but the kind of small warning his aunt's notebook had underlined twice. A crack that whistles when the wind hits it is a crack that will open under weight of water. Don't wait for the second warning. There isn't always one. He was up at the crack line with a trowel and a bag of mortar at 6 the next morning when Denny Waite rode up at a pace Denny never rode at, and said the fire had jumped the ridge in the night and was coming down the dry wash between the 2 ranches, pushed by wind nobody had forecast. The fire came down through the junipers fast, exactly the way dry fuel does, a low orange line under a column of black that turned the morning sky the color of an old bruise. It hit Thomas's swale terraces first and did something none of the county's fire crews, watching from a ridge 2 miles off with binoculars, had expected. It slowed. Not stopped, slowed. The staggered stone walls broke the ground into short, wet-shadowed steps, and the fire, instead of running the slope in one clean sheet, had to negotiate each terrace separately, losing momentum at every damp lip where the swales had held moisture against the drought. It bought time. It did not buy enough. Because above the 3rd terrace, where the cracked mortar had gone unrepaired for want of 1 more hour, the wall gave. It didn't wash out from water this time. It failed from the heat, stone popping and sliding as the fire's own convection sucked air uphill and cracked what the storms hadn't finished cracking. The gap it left ran 20 feet wide, straight down the fall line, a channel with nothing left to slow the fire at all. And worse, it opened directly onto the dry wash that ran, unbroken, toward Odessa's west pasture and the 14 horses standing in it. It was Ruin who moved first. She had been agitated for 2 days and terrified for 1, and when the smoke finally thickened enough for even a sighted horse to read as danger, she didn't run the way a frightened horse runs, scattered, blind, toward whatever gap in the fence looked open. She ran the gray strips, the striped, close-cropped ground that Silas Vane's notebook had called firebreak and Odessa's rotation had spent 2 months carving into the pasture without either of them once calling it a wall. The other 13 followed her, the way they always followed her now, and their combined weight and hooves and hunger tore straight through what remained of the pasture fence at the exact point where the grazed strip met the gap in Thomas's collapsed terrace, the one place on either property where the fire had a clean, fast run at open range. 14 horses hit that gap running, and their passage did what no plan on either side of the ridge had accounted for. It packed the loose, torn earth of the terrace breach flat and bare under 14 sets of hooves, stripping it down to raw dirt exactly where the fire needed fuel and finding none. The horses' flight, following the mosaic grazing lines Odessa had spent a summer teaching them to trust, cut directly across the gap in Thomas's wall and closed it with the one thing fire cannot burn through, ground with nothing left on it to burn. Cole Bannister was on the ridge with the fire crews when it happened, close enough with his glasses to watch a half-blind mare lead 13 broken horses straight through a hole in a stone wall he'd called foolish, and pack the gap shut with their own hoofprints while the fire hunted for fuel and, for the first time in 2 miles, could not find any. He didn't say anything. He didn't have to. He came down off that ridge at a run he hadn't managed in 15 years, past his own truck, past 2 fire crew trucks, and threw his shoulder into the last standing section of collapsed swale wall, wedging loose stone back into the gap the horses hadn't fully closed, working alongside Thomas and Odessa, who had run from opposite directions and arrived at the same 20 feet of broken ground within a minute of each other, without a word about whose plan had been foolish and whose had been wise. The fire held at the wash. It burned itself out against grazed strips and staggered stone and a wall of packed dirt no engineer had drawn, and by noon the wind swung back west, and took the smoke with it. And what was left standing on both sides of the ridge was standing because two people who had doubted each other all summer had built two different answers to the same question without ever meaning them to fit together. Odessa found Thomas afterward, ash to the knees. Both of them too tired to do anything but stand at the gap and look at what their two failures, corrected, had made together. "Your horses saved my wall," Thomas said. "Your wall gave them somewhere to run to," Odessa said. Neither of them said much else. She held out her hand, black with soot, and he took it, and that was the whole of it, the kind of thing that didn't need a speech built around it, because the ground between them had already said everything that mattered. Ruin stood at the fence a little apart from the other 13, favoring one leg, ears finally soft, watching both of them with her one good eye, as if she'd known all along what she was for, and had simply been waiting for someone to write it down. The valley told the story different ways after that, the way valleys do, but the ledgers told it the same way every time, that the ground remembers what you teach it long after the ones who taught it are gone.